Hello, welcome back to Teen Story Share. This week we're continuing So Many Beginnings, a Little Women remix by Bethany C. Morrow. And if you want to know more about this book or about the original Little Women that inspired this one, or if you would like to catch up on chapter 1 from last week, that will all be down below in the description. And just as a quick catch up from last week, if you were following along from last week, you may remember that Amy is alone in the house and several of her sisters and mother have come through, but there's not really much for Amy to do, but she is excited to hear that there's a special guest coming to the family home for dinner that night, but we don't know who it's going to be yet. Chapter 2. The Northern reporter had taken up the whole day's conversation among the boys at the build, and by the time Jo made it home and cleaned herself up, she was impatient for someone else to arrive so she could relay the news to her sisters. Mammy likely already knew of the gentleman's assignment, working for the Union officers as she did, since he had come to report on the success of the colony in order to drum up donations from wealthy Northern abolitionists. There was someone else she was anxious to tell the family about, though, and she expected a much more engaged response to news of a handsome, young black man also from up north. This one she hadn't simply heard about. Joseph Williams was his name, and despite that Jo wasn't in the habit of considering marriage prospects herself, she'd felt immediately that Meg, who thought of little but teaching and marriage, would find the nearest broom to jump at the sight of him. Jo hadn't had much chance to acquaint herself with the man, though he'd come to watch some of the construction, and just to be in their company as far as she could tell. It had occurred to her that perhaps they were a kind of novelty, when she learned that Joseph Williams was a free man visiting from Pennsylvania, and had no old life. Whatever the newly arrived young man might have called it, Jo couldn't imagine what it must be like to not know the time before the Freedpeople colonies and villages, and the pilgrimages in between, when the big houses of the North Carolina islands were still inhabited by white families who thought they could own another human being. Before those white families had run off, either to fight to keep black folk captive, or to escape the judgment brought by the veritable sea of Union soldiers, who so handily conquered the area, they had done abominable things. The truth was that if there'd never been violence, the writing of a person's name on a piece of paper that said they belonged to someone else would have been horror enough. There was no better or worse when the condition was enslavement. There were no good and bad masters when there were masters at all. Be they young or old, man or woman, ill-tempered or applauded for their mild manner, they were all heathen beasts who should have expected they'd be held to account. That they hadn't expected it, or at least that they hadn't expected to lose, only proved they were not what they claimed to be. They were not superior, Jo had always known. They couldn't be when they were so bewilderingly ignorant. Because Jo knew all this at a young age, she'd trained herself not to speak. Unless she was alone with Papa and Mammy or Meg and Beth, she'd rarely said a word as a child. She certainly didn't speak to white people. They mostly assumed her mute as a result, and thought very little of poor Meg, whom they'd made keep their daughter company during lessons, pretending to teach those lessons to her younger sister, who was clearly incapable of learning. What a revelation they would have received could they have witnessed what really went on inside Jo's head. Not speaking aloud had been her act of intentional self-preservation, but what she began because of it was a wonderful surprise. Sentences she was not yet permitted to write down, beautifully crafted with words lovingly chosen. All day she'd knit them together in her mind the way Beth would learn to stitch fabric, taking something most anyone could use and making from it something only she could conceive. She developed a formidable memory, waiting as she was forced to until much later in each day, when her family returned to the night to what the white people generously called a cabin. Then she would recite everything she'd composed that day, and even if it wasn't a story, which Meg and Beth liked best, and was instead a scathing indictment of this land and its crimes, Papa and Mammy would let her recite it. They would huddle close in a circle so tight that their knees and shoulders knocked against each other, and sometimes their foreheads too. But the old life was over. It had been for several years now. She wasn't a child anymore. She was 17, and Jo spoke as often as she'd had a mind to. She spoke freely because that's what she was. Free. She still didn't make a habit of speaking to white people. It could be reasonably avoided, now that the family had found their way to the colony. There were so many people around all the time, and if she stayed in the village, which she almost always chose to do, all those people were black like her. It was glorious, a stunning sight to look in every direction and see brown-skinned people building houses of their own, or coming and going. When she did see a white person, they were missionary teachers who'd come south to teach the newly free, or they were wearing Union uniforms. That didn't make Jo trust them, but at least it meant they were on the right side. She hadn't meant to think all of that just because of meeting Joseph Williams and finding out that he had no old life of his own. She'd been so caught up in her thoughts and memories that she was halfway to slathering sweet butter over the deep cuts she'd made in the shadfish she'd brought home. She was ready to put the first collection of them in the skillet she'd set on the wood burner when she finally heard the front door open. "Meg?" she cried, leaping back so she could look down the hall and into the front room. "Meg, are you home?" "Joanna, it's Mammy." Jo felt guilty at the way her shoulders sank. It was lovely to have a Mammy, especially the one she had, and especially because Papa was away. "Come and sit near me while I cook, Mammy. You must be tired." "If I must be, then so must you," the woman said, beginning to unpin her hair now that she was home for good. She moved much slower now, and Joanna smiled, though she could not help bristling immediately after at something her mother had once told her. There were no soldiers or officers to demand things of the woman here, and so while it was safe to take a restful posture in the comfort of her home, and despite that this was not a plantation, in the office Mammy dared not appear affected by the heat or the hours spent briskly at a dozen tasks, no matter how many times she was forced by some officer's error to rewrite a letter or document. On any such occasion they freely berated her, intimating that she was a lazy cow if she didn't work twice as fast as they had to. Though few outside the family would say so, in the March house Jo was known for her passionate character, and so Mammy had not been surprised by her daughter's outrage. Joanna had raged that she hadn't been there when one of the Union men had had the audacity to say such a thing to Mammy, who had for her entire life done more work before sundown than many a white man, and never for a day's wage, or the lavish congratulations they all seemed to require for the slightest effort. But of course, that hadn't even been the reason Mammy took issue with their complaints. It was that none of them had children to mind in the morning. She'd said that before she could even think of helping a white man sort his correspondences, or make a list of supplies, or men, or the wounded, she had to make sure her daughters were well. She had to know they were fed, even if one of the blessed dears had taken it upon themselves to prepare or set out the food. She had to see them, lay her hands on them, to know that they were all still here. Few things could silence Joanna March, but that had succeeded. It stilled her to hear her mother admit that daily she had to be convinced anew that the colony wasn't a dream, and that no one had come in the night to snatch them back. She had to hear her children, she'd said, while Jo held her breath to ensure she didn't interrupt. More than that, Mammy had told her, she had to remind her daughters that they could be heard. She had to listen to her Jo, whatever her second-born wanted to say, because it was a blessing that the girls spoke at all. She had to make sure her children knew they were her treasure. And, like people who knew something of respect and consideration, her 4 daughters didn't mind if she moved at a reasonable pace. She'd finish with a smile. Today, Mammy made it to Jo's side in her own time. She had a metal pin between her teeth, which she removed before wrapping an arm around the girl's waist. She kissed her cheek 4 times because the other 3 girls weren't there to kiss. And then Mammy let her head rest on her daughter's shoulder and breathed a full and restful sigh, which was when she smelled the skillet and the fish and the butter. "Oh, Joanna, no!" "What's the matter?" "Not shad, when we're having a gentleman guest." "You love shadfish, Mammy," Jo contested, before turning with a start. "And how was I to know there'd be a gentleman guest?" The newly arrived Joseph Williams sprang to mind, but it was too great a coincidence to imagine. "We'll either spend half the night picking bones out of our mouths, or choke on them, there are so many." Mammy sighed again, only this time it was heavy with agitation. How lucky that Mary Pollock came by the bill today then, or we wouldn't have enough of anything to offer your guest." "We have cornbread and smoked fish and plenty of fruit," Mammy said, looking around as though to confirm her stock. "And you'd rather feed a gentleman something hot, even in the dead of June, Mammy." That was true. "I don't care at all," Joe added, turning the fish once more, "but I know you do." "I do," Mammy agreed before sighing again. "Thank you, Joanna." "Thank Mary Pollock. Haven't you been listening? The boys and I are nearly finished building her house, and she's so pleased to have been next on the list that she went by the fishery and brought us each a feast of them." "I'll thank Mary tomorrow, if none of us choke on shad bones tonight." Joe laughed as Mammy retreated to her bedroom to store the handful of pins she'd fished out of her rolled hair. The night was still warm, so she would no doubt braid and cover it with a crocheted snood, so that it stayed off her neck but still looked becoming for their guest. "It smells wonderful," Meg said in salutation before anyone knew she'd come home, "but I couldn't bear to stand before a stove in this heat." On her way out to the yard, Meg poked her younger sister in the ribs, and then she was back outside. Joe heard her working the pump and then giving a quiet prayer of thanks when she brought the cool water to wet her face and neck. Joe smiled. "We're all lucky I had the conviction, since Mammy's invited someone home." Meg re-entered the house. "Oh?" "Meg, you're home!" their mother exclaimed when she returned to the kitchen. "I meant to send word to you at the school, but I couldn't get away again, and now he'll arrive at any moment, and with Beth and Amy still not back." She was speaking excitedly, and, though she'd seemed tired before, now Joe could guess at the prayers her mother might have said throughout the day. "You have high hopes for this gentleman, whoever he is," she said, somewhat incredulously. "Gentleman?" Meg wrapped one arm around her own waist and straightened. "She has invited someone to supper and hasn't even told us his name," Joe explained. "But he must have impressed you, Mammy. You sound ready to commission Meg's wedding gown." Now both of Meg's arms tensed at her sides, and if Joe noticed, at least she didn't make a show of it. It would be embarrassing to find it common knowledge how distracted Meg had become this past year, wondering when she'd marry, and whom. She was 19, and Mammy assured her it would be several years before anyone wondered why she wasn't. It was meant to put her at ease, but the problem was that Meg wished to be courting and couldn't help being disappointed not to be. Worse, men poured into the colony on almost a daily basis, but few were prospects. They were too young, or else they came with wives already, or women they intended to marry. Others were concerned with the war, and when they would be allowed to enlist in the Union. They had no head for romance, and Meg had every desire to be a wife, but none to be made a war widow. "Don't be dramatic, Joe," Mammy said, but then she covered her mouth with her hand, and both her daughters knew that Joanna had been right. "I thought I was the only one desperate to find me a husband," Meg said, doing only slightly better at seeming calm. "Well, at least tell us who he is." Mammy looked between her two eldest daughters, whose eyes were wide and expecting, one with nervous anxiety, the other with curious excitement. "If ever I were going to make a perfect husband for you, Meg, it would be him," she said, taking her eldest daughter's hand. "He is the kind of man Papa would adore. I know it. That's the first thing I thought when we met." "Which was only this afternoon," Joe said with a smirk that made Mammy drop her chin a bit, as though embarrassed. "That's true. I shouldn't have let my imagination get away from me. It matters more what Meg thinks of Joseph than your father or me." "Joseph?" Joe asked incredulously. "Joseph Williams?" "That's right." Now it was Meg whose attention volleyed between the other two women. "Will someone please tell me who this Joseph Williams is?" In reply, Joe grabbed her sister's wrist from Mammy's hand and pulled her from the kitchen and toward their bedroom. "It turns out Mammy might be right, Meg," Joe explained, closing the door behind them and pushing her older sister backward, until she had no choice but to drop onto the bed they shared. Then she opened the trunk where Beth kept all the lovely pieces she fashioned for her sisters, among the scraps that were not yet completed. "You know something of this Joseph Williams, too?" Meg asked, unbuttoning the blouse she'd worn all that very hot day. Mammy burst into the bedroom with a tin wash basin and rag thrown over her shoulder, both of which she placed on the stand between the two beds, where all four of her children slept. "I'll see to supper, Joe," she said, submerging the rag before wringing it and handing it to Meg to wash her face and neck. When she left, she closed the door behind her, and at the sound of the front door opening, both Meg and Joe froze. They waited and listened, but soon they heard their youngest sister shriek and telling Mammy about her day. Relieved, they set back to the task of beautifying Meg. "Put this one on," Joe said, tossing a delicate blouse onto the bed before taking the rag and submerging it again. "But wash under your arms first." She wiped her damp hands on her skirt and went back to the trunk for a belt, and then knelt down and felt underneath Amy's pillow before retrieving something wrapped in lace. Meg was nearly put back together now. She stretched her neck to see around Joe's shoulder at the contents of the lace bundle. "I hope she won't mind," she said, smiling at the revealed hair comb. "If she does, she'll mend." Joe came back to their bed, and Meg turned so that the comb could be fitted into her hair. It was lovely and ornate, with 7 long teeth, and a scrolling floral design hand-carved into its metal. It was also not the kind of thing any of them would have owned before finding shelter at the abandoned big house en route to the colony. There had been so many treasures there left behind when the previous residents fled. The best had been hidden for safekeeping, as though someone intended to return one day. It had become a daily pastime while the March family sheltered there, the girls searching for nooks and crannies where something else might be tucked away. Amy had come upon the hair comb beneath a loose bit of flooring in the largest bedroom, and claimed it as her own. It was fair that she should consider it hers, but they were sisters, Joe thought, and she shouldn't be bothered to share things. "How do I look?" Meg asked when they were finished. "Like you haven't been standing on your feet all day in a tent teaching Freedpeople their letters despite the heat, because you know how important it will be that we all know how to make our marks." The two held each other's arms, cradling elbows, and smiled. "Although I think Mr. Williams should know," Joe added. "How else will he understand how lucky he'd be to win your attention?" "If by some miracle he doesn't, I trust my Joanna to set him straight." They each took a deep breath and then reopened the bedroom door. "Mammy wouldn't let me go inside my own bedroom," Amy huffed as she barreled past them. Surely she had no need to occupy it, but was offended at the restriction. Beth, on the other hand, had 2 heavy bundles to stow. One she held in her arms, and the other she pushed with her foot down the hall, before nudging it into the room. "Do you like the blouse, Meg?" she asked. "It's the thinnest material. I was worried I'd ruin it." "It came out perfectly, Bethlehem. It's refreshing to wear in this weather." Everyone milled about at their various tasks, and rarely in the same room, but kept up several conversations at once, as they always did. "Come and help clear the table so we can set it," Mammy said to whomever had free hands, and Amy came bounding out of the bedroom where she had flounced on her bed, and watched Beth organize what they had brought home. "Where did this come from?" Joe exclaimed, coming down the hall with a pie in her hands. Meg leaned close to smell it. "Is that molasses apple?" "Florence at the big house made it to thank Beth for the way she mended a dress that must have belonged to the master's wife," Amy replied. It was only that caused the house to quiet, 3 of the sisters and Mammy halting and looking at each other before looking back at Amethyst. Joe put the pie on the table and then held the youngest's hands. No one else was ready to speak, or else would need too many moments to decide how best to redress the conversation. So it came to Joe. "I know that's what we called them, Amy, but not now. Words are so terribly important. You know I think so. And it matters what we call each other, and what we call everyone else." Her usually excitable baby sister looked small, with her eyes wide, and wondering, as though she weren't certain whether she was being chastised. But Joe was only correcting her. Joe spoke gently now, so that the young girl wasn't confused into thinking she'd done anything wrong. "No one was ever a master, dear heart. They were only enslavers, and they aren't now. Not anymore, and never again." "But they might be," Amy replied. It was more timid than her usual nature, and her eyes roamed a bit without landing on anyone too long. "The war's not over." It was just like her to say something that no one else dared, but it didn't mean she was the only one to think it. In the front room of this house, built just for them, before there were groups of young men and not so young organized to do it, and while the 5 had been still living as refugees on the mainland in an abandoned big house with nearly 100 others. The March women huddled closer without thinking to. Arms wound around waists and hands landed on shoulders after touching a cheek or a coil of hair. Jo knelt down, even though it meant that the youngest was above her now. She kept Amy's hands in hers. "It is here," she said. "Here and New Bern, and as far as Corinth, Mississippi, where Papa's gone. The war's been won." She felt Beth, Meg, and Mammy close behind her, and she nodded up at Amy. "This is a Freedpeople's colony. That's what they call it, all over the country. They know about us and this place and what we're building. Everybody knows we're free now." She smiled so she wouldn't cry. That wouldn't do. Her sister would be confused and think she was telling one of her tales, meant to pacify the young ones, but not meant to be true. And this was. "That's the way it'll stay, Amethyst. I give you my word." It was quiet after that, Jo on her knees, and Amy's hands in hers, the other 3 standing close enough to share a breath. It was still enough to hear an angel pass overhead, until there came a knock at the door. They'd all but forgotten Mr. Joseph Williams, and now a guest felt almost like an intrusion. "Well," Mammy said, breaking the spell, after which everyone breathed again and stood a little ways apart. "Bethlehem, would you see to the door? And Amy, help Joanna in the kitchen." They dispersed at her command, except for Meg, who wove her fingers through her mother's. When Bethlehem invited him in, Joseph Williams took off his hat before entering, and Meg March was already smitten. All right, come back and join us again next Friday to hear Chapter 3. I hope you have a great weekend. Thanks for joining us on Teen Story Share. Bye!